There are. We've got half an hour for discussion. There are a lot of themes in there that we could pick up. One of them clearly is this dilemma we've got, which is the UN multilateral system is the one that we all want to work, but it's extraordinarily sluggish, has been for decades. What do we do about that? It simply isn't responsive in the time frames we need it to be. Chris, you made a really interesting point at the end. The expectation that people have of these missions doesn't always sit either with the mandate of these missions or the way in which that's interpreted.
Or the resources they're given.
Or the resources. I saw MONUC in action in Congo earlier this year. And there's an extraordinary feeling of anger amongst the people at the failure of MONUC to protect them. They protect themselves pretty well. They certainly don't protect the civilian population. It creates anger, rather than the very thing we needed them to create, which was trust and so on. All sorts of reasons for that, which we might explore. But anyway, I'm going to open it up now to the floor. If you would, say your name and where you're from, and there's a mic which will come round. I think it's slightly down. Yes, we've got two questions here.
Hello. Yeah, that's better.
Jill McGivering from BBC. Chris, I was very interested in what you're saying about the need to try and engage and shrink the gap between military operations, which have a specific function and training and so on, and those more civilian areas of development, for example. But in reality, in an ongoing conflict, when it is the stability is such a problem, like in parts of Afghanistan still now, how do you make it possible for the people who are non-military to be able to engage with the civilian population? Because certainly having been in Helmand with the military, you do feel this enormous divide that they have to think in terms of the civilian population is a threat, and where it is not a threat, then it's almost invisible, and very difficult for the people involved in development to have access to them to do their work.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mine's a very different kind of question. My name's Jill Lusk. I'm Associate Editor of Africa Confidential, and I'm a journalist specialising in Sudan. I'd like to ask about the parties to the peace agreement. Mr. Vendrell and Chris Johnson sort of alluded to this vaguely, but surely the central issue has to be the politics of trust between those who've signed the peace agreement. Do those parties intend in any serious way to keep that peace agreement? I mean, in Sudan, it's very clear that the government has used war as a strategy. Since it took power in a coup in 1989, it used it in the south, then in Darfur, now again in the south, obviously including Abyei in that, and the east as well.
You're talking about the CPA or the Darfur?
Both. It uses war as a strategy. It does not necessarily want peace, and that assumption means that peacekeeping, is built on a very shaky basis. Thank you.
Any other questions before I put this back to the panel? Yes, please.
David French, Convener Associates and formerly Chief Executive of the Westminster Foundation for Democracy. I want to pick up, Chris Johnson, on a point you particularly made, but also I wonder whether Ambassador Vendrell would like to comment on this. You talked about the need for clearer political analysis. What I wasn't clear about was what difference that clearer political analysis might then make to the kind of operational arrangements that all three of you have been discussing on the ground. I realise there's a session later in the series looking at the whole issue of political settlements, which seems to me to be a fundamental requirement in the situations that you're all discussing. But what would be the practical benefits and consequences of the clearer political analysis that you're describing?
Thank you. I'm going to hand back to you. Who wants to lead off, Chris?
Okay. In some ways, I think the first question and the last question partly connect for me. I think the thing about political, military, civilian military, and how people can work together depends a bit on what you analyse the situation to be. In Sudan, north-south, we had a peace agreement. It was a pretty shaky peace agreement. There was mixed commitment to that peace agreement, but there was something that you could work with, and it was not essentially a hostile environment for civilian actors. It was not dangerous. In Afghanistan, particularly in areas like Helmand, I think it's much more like Somalia. And one of the big fracture points in Somalia that, you know, we're looking at is the way that the humanitarians, and I was talking to James about this earlier, very clearly saying we want nothing to do with the military. Because while the political military side was saying we have a peace agreement here brought about by the Djibouti process at the end of last year, a transitional federal government, the best way to keep peace in Somalia is to support that government, the humanitarians are saying, guys, you're dreaming. This good try, but it hasn't worked. It's failed like every other peace agreement has failed in Somalia. We are back in war, and as humanitarians, we dare not be seen to be on one side of that war. So I think what you can do depends on the situation that you're in. So I think that's, you know, that's one thing about analysis. And I think if I look specifically about UNMISS and the North-South agreement in Abyei, I think clearer analysis of what the trouble spots still were in that agreement. And there were certain key geographical areas linked to certain key political issues that were trouble spots. And we should have much more been able to focus the resources of that mission onto those trouble spots and to have had clear strategies for how we worked within them and how we were going to move forward. But one of the big problems is if you don't have political will. One of the reasons we were in a model, we couldn't protect civilians in Abyei back in May of last year when we failed completely, was that we did not have access north of the town, which was where the trouble started. And the South, the armed forces, stopped us moving north. That had happened since the beginning of the mission. We failed to get any political leverage on that. And we failed because essentially the member states seemed incapable of dealing with more than one issue at once. And so having ignored Darfur to get a North-South agreement through, once they'd signed the North-South agreement, they stopped remembering that there was a lot of work still to be done. That agreement needed shepherding, it needed nursing, it needed continual political engagement and pressure and a process of building trust and working with people and working on the difficult issues that were still outstanding. And we didn't do that. And so we never solved a political issue about movement, and so we could never do properly the one thing that I think is critical, and which I think the General referred to, which is good monitoring. If you see a problem, you need to be able to move fast with your internationals, but with also your people from both of the parties you brought in, the previously fighting parties, and go and deal with that. And that's a political issue as well as a military issue.
Just 4 quick points. First, the UN used to do much better. In 1956, UNEF, the first large peacekeeping mission in the Middle East, was deployed in 72 hours. It has become idiotically bureaucratized. And I don't think any Secretary General will succeed in untangling the web. What you can do is what we did in East Timor, which was first to use, to kickstart a mission, to use voluntary funds, and then get the assessed budget coming later. Second, politics of trust. Well, it's quite. I mean, in many cases, of course, it's quite clear that the parties are not serious. In the case of the agreement on East Timor between Portugal and Indonesia on May 4th of '99, I think some of us in the Secretariat realized that the Indonesian army was certainly not going to play by the rules. The trouble was that first we could not delay it because there was a danger of missing the window of opportunity, and second because governments still wanted to believe that Indonesia would comply with its promises. And DPKO had made no preparations for the likely result of either choosing independence or the Indonesians creating a problem. And it was only in talks that I had with a senior military officer in Australia that I think meant that the Australians probably were somewhat ready for a possible intervention, as they actually did play. Political analysis makes no difference if it's only amongst the junior personnel. It's important that the people above those who undertake political analysis buy it and have the courage to buy it, even when it's not a very pleasant analysis, the one that the junior people are producing. And finally, I think it's important to have it clear that missions are deployed in countries to support populations and to implement agreements. They are not there to support the government.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me just mention that conflicts since 1989, the Berlin Wall fell down, everybody was very optimistic. From interstate to intrastate conflicts. That is a much more difficult situation. Even the superpowers put all their effort in to support the UN, and they rapidly turn over 100,000 peacekeepers in the field, which they couldn't support properly. So about the civil-military cooperation, as was asked by here. Of course, in Afghanistan, to make everything properly, you have to flatten everything. Sorry to say. It's very difficult to go into a situation like that, 65%. But anyhow, I can mention one example from Nepal that worked. We had good cooperation, the military monitors, the civil affairs monitors, headed by Mr. John Bevan here, and the human rights monitors. We met regularly, we informed about cases, and we even did joint operations and joint investigations. Even preventive we did so, and that's very important. If you have an ally in the local public, they will tell you if something is coming up, I'm quite sure. And if you are able to show force, even with 3 helicopters and 15 monitors, human rights monitors, civil affairs monitors on the ground, that could be enough to stop the whole thing. So that's very important to work together. And of course, the alternative is like IFOR in Bosnia, 60,000 troops, battle tanks, everything. You flatten all opposition. They don't even have to fire. The other thing that was mentioned here was about clear political analysis. Let me just respond very quickly to that, because I have been discussing a lot of Security Council resolutions. You have probably read a lot of them, and they are not very distinct. After that, the UN sends what they call a TAM. In my language, that means lame, but anyhow, it's a technical assessment mission. They come to the mission and do something look-alike what you are asking for. And luckily in Nepal, both John and I was there with good experience, because we had been advisor to the SRSG for 3 months when this team come in. That was air-landed into the combat zone and didn't know the direction of north and couldn't help us very much. And if this happens without the presence on the ground before, you can have a very poor result. But this is very important because it will give direction to the military monitors, to the civil affairs, the human rights, and the rest of the UN family. So it's fairly important. But let me also mention my experience from 14 different missions, is that you even have to do more than is written in the Security Council resolution, the direction from the SRSD. You have to do even more to make it work on the ground.
General, thank you. And I'm going to take another round of questions now. So, please, at the back. Yeah.
My name is Peter Tesh. I'm, for this purpose, media advisor to the Indonesian embassy. But I won't go into Timor, but I just wonder whether nation building should be a task for missions. But I have a more practical issue about humanitarian cooperation and peace missions, and that's because I've also an interest in Sudan. Is often I hear from the humanitarian community that they don't really want to seek the protection of the armed missions because they want to be seen, as you said, independent. But if the humanitarians get into trouble, it's the armed missions who have to airlift them. So there seems to be a bit of a contradiction.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay. It would be good to explore that. I've got lots, so I'm going to try and break this down into a small group. Sophia here, and then 1, 2, 3, and then I'll come to you, if that's right.
Thanks. Sophia Swithin from Oxfam. I just wanted to pick up on one of your points, Chris, that James alluded to, which is this mismatch between community expectations and mandate. And that's something we're very concerned with, not so much from that, because we've found that actually community expectations are spot on in terms of mandate. All but one of the 14 UN peacekeeping missions has a protection element, and some of those are very ambitious protection elements. And what we're seeing mismatches between community expectations and the battalion on the ground, the Nepali battalion somewhere in North Kivu's ability to understand that mandate and to resource it. So in relation to that mismatch, we're seeing kind of, I think, sort of 3 schools of thought about a response. One is that the UN should just stop being so ambitious and should just roll back these large peacekeeping mandates, to have much smaller elements of peacekeeping, protection of civilian mandates. The other school is that there should be political will to just scale up the resources to meet these big promises. And the other is that we just sort of muddle along and make do and mend, and that troops should do what they can on the ground. I was just wondering where the panellists see the future in relation to those options.
Thank you. So, you and the...
Yahya al-Bashir, SLM Sudan. Particularly speaking about Darfur cases. Now there are UN African Union troops on the ground, and they cannot be able even to protect themselves. How can they protect civilians? So, if I put the questions, if UN fail to distinguish between peacemaking and peacekeeping, and also if we see the UN in the links of the Cold War, 1945, the fundamental conflict has been changed. Now most of the conflicts within the state borders, and the philosophy of the UN to address these conflicts has not, because according to the resources, according to the mandate, and also according to the will to take actions. My question is that UN peacekeeping force, can they take assistance from another regional organizations like NATO in terms of the resources? Because we see many examples being successful with the NATO's stop ethnic cleansing in Bosnia, and also Kosovo. Even also British troops, 1,000 British troops also sent to the Sierra Leone also make a difference. Can UN also assist with the NATO as well to make a difference on the ground?
Thank you. And I'll take one more before we come back to the, yes, please, on the end.
Edouard Bellon, Safer World. Thanks you very much for the presentation. We had a lot of complex issues, and I know that we apparently really need to find a common term: peacekeeping, peace building, integrated mission. I don't know if what we do is evolving, but there is definitely a need here to clarify. I had a hard time in my head trying to know what we are talking about exactly, but. And maybe also extend the analysis to the role of the EU, the SDP mission, the African Union. That would be interesting to see if they are developing peacekeeping or stabilization operation on the model of the UN. That maybe, but just a thought. My question is more related on what can we do to improve. I tried to summarize the issue you mentioned, and I have on my notebook: lack of mandate clarity, lack of resources, lack of context analysis, lack of conviction, lack of reactivity, maybe bureaucratic burden. There was another one, is the lack of popular support often. We talked about the Congo, I think, and I was in Nepal recently. And you can see the rather widespread distrust from the population regarding UNMIN. Certainly not because of UNMIN, certainly because of the political statement that lead UNMIN not able to do much about the situation. But there is really a distrust. So I wanted to have the panelists' view on what local NGOs and maybe international NGOs can do to ease the relationship between UN peacekeeping missions and the population, maybe in terms of identifying issues, early warning, implementing operation with the population, these kind of things. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, panel, we've got questions here about, I think, the apparent paradox that humanitarians don't want to associate with the military, but rather depend on the military for access, for evacuation, and so on. We've got something here about community expectations, and those expectations may be realistic in principle, but in practice they're not. What do we need to do to bridge that reality gap, which links to that last question as well? And we've also got this question about NATO assistance to regional forces and so on. Who wants to come in on any or all of those?
Yeah. Just this regional arrangement is very well mentioned in the UN Charter, Chapter 8 it's called, where it can be solved regionally and supported by the United Nations. United Nations should, to my opinion, always give the mandate for all these kind of things. Otherwise, I will doubt the legality. A lot can be said, but they are the only one. And this has happened for the African Union troops in Darfur. It's a problem. But you know as well as me that Omar Bashir, who I know from my stay in Sudan, had denied all Europeans to go into Darfur. So we have, for example, now a hospital from my country on the other side of the border and so on. So he is freezing. He has to be taken out, to put it bluntly.
Just putting it bluntly.
Yeah. When I'm still speaking, nation building, yes, if that is a part of the mandate. I was recently in New York discussing sexual violence as a weapon and used by the parties in conflict. And we were lucky because we had that in our mandate in Nepal and so in the Nuba Mountains. So we have some experience with that. But let me just say, I think Sarah was in Khartoum when this happened. It was 8 different UN organizations with their own budget, officed up in Khartoum, and the same down in the regional capital where I was, in Kadugli. There were waterproof or bulletproof walls between the 8 pipelines going down. There was no cooperation on the top and nothing in the bottom. And this has to be cleaned up, to my opinion, because these organizations need to show the example of how to cooperate, and they can invite all the other NGOs and so on in that. I asked Mr. Pronk, do something about this. He said it's mission impossible, because this is directed from New York, where they get their budgets. So this is a thing we also need to look into, because that will be a vital part of the nation building. Schools, water, whatever, must go together with controlling the security on the ground.
Thank you.
Just briefly, if the UN is not going to do nation building, who is it? Who will? It is no longer politically correct to have, let's say, one European country doing the nation building. So at least it has to be dressed up as a UN operation. And even then, we always have to come with two problems. First problem, lack of money. Why do we have lack of money? Because until recently, at any rate, the US has never been willing to contribute money to build up countries. There is no administrative capacity in the UN to build up countries. That's why I was talking earlier about the need to have, in some key countries, some reserve manpower that could be used when the need arose, even if, again, it would have to be dressed up very carefully, so it would not look, it would not be open to charges of neo-colonialism, not so much by the population of the country involved, but by the governments of those countries. NGOs and early warning, I think NGOs are tremendously useful in early warning, both in situations where there is not yet a conflict, or in places like, for example, Afghanistan, where they are often much more in touch with the population than diplomats, let alone the military or the police. Now, this is, again, something that needs to be changed. It is absolutely ridiculous that, for example, the rules to protect the EU police force are much higher than the rules to protect the civilian staff of the EU. I mean, there is clearly an imbalance here, but it seems to me that increasingly the NGOs run always the greatest risk. They are then followed by the UN and some diplomats, and finally the army arrives. And the first ones out tend to be first the army, then the diplomats, and finally the NGOs. Surely this cannot continue. It is not serious.
Thank you. Chris, briefly if you would, and then we'll...
Yeah, NGOs and the whole humanitarian thing, first of all. Two comments. I mean, the first is that I think if you ever end up in a situation of fighting as a UN mission with resources, you have the responsibility to get people out. And we put everybody on the helicopter, including national staff of NGOs who felt unsafe, and nobody in my headquarters ever questioned that. And I think that's right. You know, we pull people out if they're in a dangerous situation. In terms of more actively keeping people working, I think if you have a basic respect for what people are doing both ways, you can find ways. You know, we put, at the request of an NGO, in order to keep health services going in a very difficult situation, we put an UNMO patrol in on the day they were doing clinics. We never did it together. We just happened to be patrolling through. And that was our agreement on how we would enable them to work without, at the same time, compromising their independence. So I think you can find these things if you have that mutual respect, that people need to work in different ways in a place in order to maximise, you know, what you can bring as benefit to the population, which at the end of the day should be what we're about. In terms of protection mandates, I think we need to be much better at thinking it through and being honest. We stick this protection mandate in all sorts. It's a bit like, you know, human rights and gender now. It's and elections. We have this list of things that go into every peace agreement, every mandate for missions, without thinking through what it is possible to actually deliver. Sometimes you can deliver good protection strategies, and sometimes, frankly, it's not possible to protect everybody. I have a sympathy for the people in Kivu. I'm not saying, you know, that we couldn't do better with the military, with better training, with more thinking, but in areas like Kivu, in areas like Darfur, huge areas with small amounts of troops, often not particularly well-equipped troops, certainly not troops trained for working in those areas. You've also got to have the limits of what is possible rather than pretending. So I think, A, some honesty, B, some real learning, of the kinds of strategies that you can get to protect people, which I think a lot of them are about really good joint patrolling, access, visibility. When we did work well in ABA, we set up things with our UNPOL and the local police and series of police posts backed up by daily patrols with UNMOs to keep that presence going. But we were a small area. Darfur is huge. You know, the Kivus are huge. So we also have to be honest. I think we owe that to people.
Thank you, Chris. And if we had more time, it would be really interesting to pursue with you whether there's a fundamental difference between consensual operations, the Chapter 6 typical operations, and our ability to protect in those, as you've described in the war, and the peace enforcement Chapter 7 operations. That may or may not come up. We are pretty well at time. If people agree and can stay, I suggest can we run for 10 more minutes? Because I would like to take at least a couple more questions, and I'm going to ask you to make them very brief, if you would. And there's a lady here who I missed out the first time round, and I apologise. I'm afraid I can't take all of you. I apologise. So I'm going to have to take the person waving frantically at the front here, and I'll take. Yeah, okay. Look, I'm going to take the two of you. Sorry. So it's starting here.
Yeah. Okay. Hi, I'm Claudia Salmons. I'm a student, postgraduate student at LSE. I have a question that's a bit more general. You talked a lot about the problems of the UN system in terms of, you, Chris Johnson, talked a lot about, copying models for peacekeeping missions and state building and so on, that it's not working, and withdrawing just after a peace agreement has been signed, so on and so forth. For me, as a student, it seems to be that everybody agrees on that, academics as well as professionals, as well as UN personnel and so on. So could you just try to explain, or how you would explain the blindness of the UN as a system, or also the member states, the individual member states, towards this problem, or these lots of problems? Because I mean, I see today what happens in Afghanistan, and even though it was predictable, now it can be huge political problems to those member states and to the states individually involved. Like, for example, I'm German. In Germany now there's a huge debate on it. So why are those states so
Thank you. And you're going to have to do that in 30 seconds. Yes, please, at the front.
My name is Hans-Peter Ulrich, Civio Public Policy Consulting. When I read the paper on Afghanistan, I'm always stunned. We read so much about aggressive acts on both sides. We don't read anything about communication. When Germany complained about some casualties recently, or cried about them, one has to say, as people do here, and we see the pictures in the papers here, well, I called the German Department of Defense and asked, which role does communication play in Afghanistan? And first I got a very wishy-washy answer, then I asked back, and somebody, PR person, finally said, sounds like an interesting idea. We may have to check it out. Yeah. So, in a way, I wonder, are we really entitled to send people there if we don't communicate? Okay, I don't want to be naive. One cannot communicate with everybody. But strategic questions are, what are our goals in Afghanistan? Who do we fight against? Are they criminals? Are they religiously misled people, maybe? Do they have valuable goals, religious goals? Are they uneducated children? Are we allowed to kill children who haven't had the chance for a decent school education? Well, we have to take other measures against drug dealers, maybe, and people who just enjoy terrorism. Questions. Who makes a strategy in Afghanistan? Do we have a lack of leadership in these kinds of questions? Do we involve population enough? Do we justify our actions in sending people there sufficiently? Thank you.
Thank you. And the last two questions, if you would, yes.
Sure. Very, very quickly, Locke Ferguson from Safer World again. In this conversation and others, there seems to be an overwhelming emphasis on troops and military response or provision of protection. the application of military force or violence or the deterrence of that to provide protection. But obviously that's not the only component of protection. And in many UN peacekeeping missions, the troops there don't necessarily even have the capacity to protect themselves. So therefore, I want to try and draw out some more specifics from the panel. So therefore, in the civilian components of peacekeeping missions, what are their special attributes? What capabilities can they bring that can be applied in terms of protection beyond, again, the threat or the use of violence against violence?
Thank you. Yes, indeed.
Hi, thank you. My name's Naomi Ashita. I worked in peacekeeping both in New York and in the field for a number of years. And I just want to make one comment and a question for Mr. Francesc Vendrell. The comment is that during the discussion there wasn't really any mention of how the Security Council and how the member states who sit in the Security Council, particularly the P5, shape mandates and also influence, the deployment of peacekeeping operations into environments where really there's no peace to keep. And just sort of as a kind of notes. I mean, now DPKO is in the sort of counterintuitive position of having to argue with Security Council members and with others in the UN against deploying operations in places like Somalia. And actually, in Darfur, it was an issue to begin with. So that's my comment. And my question is to Mr. Francesc Vendrell. I'd like to get your perspective on where you see Afghanistan going now, and so how to deal with, the tension between nation building and having to deal, with very concrete security concerns and threats dealing with the Taliban. So how do you reconcile the two, basically, and what's your perspective?
For which you've also got 30 seconds. That's a very simple one. Thank you for all of those. Panel, back to you for a last time. Who wants to go first, Chris?
Oh, I think Ambassador, please.
I think one of the questions, why do member states who know the situation nonetheless vote for mandates that they know cannot be implemented? Well, I think there is an element of political correctness. There is a lack of courage in saying no. I think the Secretary General should be saying no more often than he does when he's been asked to carry out mandates that are clearly impossible to fulfill. I think it is worse to have a mission deployed in the Congo where the civilians are blaming the UN for not protecting them than not to have the UN there at all. Who makes a strategy in Afghanistan? Well, very clearly, assuming anyone makes a strategy, has a strategy, it's certainly the US. And the others try desperately to influence the US. The EU fails to articulate a single policy, even though perhaps mentally most member states are of the same view. As to where Afghanistan is going, well, that would take us another hour at least. But let me simply say that I don't think there's a wrong disjunctive developing. One is to say, well, there are those who believe that one should simply be in Afghanistan to fight the Taliban and to fight Al-Qaeda, and those who say, well, we're there to build institutions and in a way normalize the country. I don't think you can fight the Taliban unless you provide good governance, unless you have there is less corruption, unless you improve the delivery of services. So it really is not either or. But I suspect that we will probably end up going for an anti-terrorism strategy that will leave most of the Afghans in the sad situation they're in, or possibly worse, and we will find a way to redefine success and have a small force in Afghanistan that would be able to send AWACS or special forces to kill anyone suspected of having links with Al Qaeda.
I have a comment on that.
Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah. It was asked by you about security and military troops. Well, they are a different quality. We also have UN police. And to me, they are both political contributions because they are sent by a specific country. The third category must be specialists working on contract, let's say more or less a permanent UN contract as UN staff. Because then at least somebody is responsible for their acts, UN itself. But to have all these nice or not nice private security companies, I'm not too fond of them, because there is nothing to respond to. There is no governmental organization over them. They are only pure business companies. Even in some cases they are very efficient, but the UN cannot use this, I'm sure.
Thank you. Chris?
Very quickly, I mean, I would agree with Ambassador Vendrell. I think we need to say no more often, and I think DPKO is absolutely right to be cautious of going into Somalia. Somalia needs a political solution, and until we have a political solution, no amount of, so-called peacekeeping is going to help, and it risks actually taking the energy away from finding out the very hard way to a political solution between Somalis, and a solution that works for Somalis, not a solution that works for the US or anybody else. And just focusing that on, getting rid of the infidel occupier in the form of a UN force, and that would, I think, be a complete disaster. I think why we often, even when we know what's right, do what's wrong, is about two things. It's about a point Vendrell made early on about, getting your analysis heard at the top. If a political direction like the US was in the early days of Afghanistan post 9/11 running so strong, you can't get heard in that dynamic, however hard you try, however coherent your arguments. And secondly, the UN has very little in the way of its own resources. It certainly has no troops. It has to get troop-contributing countries, and people are often cautious. Sometimes that's quite useful, and I think Somalia is one of those instances. Protection, yes, it's very different, I think, in consensual environments and non-consensual, especially when the non-consensual are part of these bigger wars. But I think it is also, as you say, it's about civilian strategies as well. It's about police, it's about civil affairs. It's also about WFP being there with their food distributions and having that hat. It's about NGOs being there. It's about that whole web of things and it all working together.
Chris, thank you. And thank you all very much for coming. I'm sorry for those who didn't get to ask their questions, but we run over time. I'd just like to end by thanking our panel very much for an excellent session. Thank you.